build resilient agriculture. The Inter-American Committee on Ports is building human and institutional capacity through public-private partnerships to address port modernization, logistics, and security. CooperaNet, SETI's multi-stakeholder platform for cooperation and partnerships, is being relaunched in 2019, responding to member states' call for a more robust hub for cooperation. As more consumers begin or end their shopping process online, SETI has entered into a partnership with the private sector to digitize millions of micro, small, and medium enterprises across the region.
Las buenas noticias es que sabemos por qué están fracasando, porque no son visibles. Y el hecho de que ahora lo puedan ser, haciéndolo ellas mismas, no solamente rompemos las tres barreras del tiempo, conocimiento y dinero, sino que les permitimos tener éxito y dejar de fracasar a los porcentajes que lo hacen ahora.
Es una herramienta que sin duda acerca a las MIPYMES hacia la demanda que hoy está migrando a Internet, y con eso pretendemos mejorar las ventas y el posicionamiento de las empresas pequeñas.
As we look to the future, the Executive Secretariat for Integral Development will continue to leverage cooperation and partnerships to expand our reach, proving that together we are much more than the sum of our 34 member states.
Me and my kids have been there for over an year right now. And children are friends. It doesn't matter where they come from.
Nosotros estamos en una zona netamente selvática. La línea de adyacencia va desde el norte hasta el sur, va desde Modesto Méndez hasta Aguas Turbias, tanto en el norte como en el sur. Esta línea tiene 215 kilómetros de extensión.
De allí vino él, se buscó creo con los de la OEA, y de allí vino el proyecto para acá, para Judá. Y fue que lo dieron el terreno, y lo dieron todo lo que era mano de obra y el material para hacer las casas que están ahorita. Y por ese motivo estamos aquí viviendo todavía.
La misión continúa trabajando en la implementación de medidas de fomento de la confianza mientras aguarda el resultado del reclamo que está atendiendo la Corte Internacional de Justicia por la disputa marítima, territorial e insular. Nuestra oficina en la zona de adyacencia realiza verificaciones a solicitud de ambos gobiernos, facilita reuniones y patrullajes conjuntos entre las Fuerzas Armadas y promueve una cultura de paz y cooperación entre las comunidades locales.
Children will be children and they have harmony. They don't see each other as a different country, but they see each other that they're growing together.
Este video fue producido con la ayuda financiera de la Unión Europea.
Hoy, esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos no podemos ser neutrales.
More than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
Este esfuerzo, el cual viene siendo apoyado por la Organización de los Estados Americanos, nos permitirá tener una gran información para poder mapear estas iniciativas de innovación y poder que ellas contribuyan al crecimiento económico, a la competitividad y al bienestar de nuestras naciones.
Como bien sabemos, nos encontramos ya en la cuarta revolución industrial, la que está cambiando rápidamente la forma en que se hace negocio, se produce, se consume y se genera bienestar y entretenimiento en el mundo. Es la mayor amenaza, tal vez la mejor oportunidad que tenemos en nuestras naciones.
The Inter-American Teacher Education Network, the I-10, is working to improve the quality of teachers with an emphasis on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education. In 2019, the I-10 launched the first STEM Teacher Fellowship of the Americas. The Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas, ECPA, is working with governments in the Caribbean to advance electric mobility and clean transport as the sub-region pursues energy independence. Under our Integrated Water Resource Management Program, SETI is responding to the demand for platforms and applications that capture and disseminate real-time information. This includes the expansion of Costa Rica's Plataforma Interactiva de Aplicación del Clima Tropical to the rest of Central America to help build resilient agriculture. The Inter-American Committee on Ports is building human and institutional capacity through public-private partnerships to address port modernization, logistics, and security. CooperaNet, SETI's multi-stakeholder platform for cooperation and partnerships, is being relaunched in 2019, responding to member states' call for a more robust hub for cooperation. As more consumers begin or end their shopping process online, SETI has entered into a partnership with the private sector to digitize millions of micro, small, and medium enterprises across the region.
Las buenas noticias es que sabemos por qué están fracasando, porque no son visibles. Y el hecho de que ahora lo puedan ser, haciéndolo ellas mismas, no solamente rompemos las tres barreras del tiempo, conocimiento y dinero, sino que les permitimos tener éxito y dejar de fracasar a los porcentajes que lo hacen ahora.
Es una herramienta que sin duda acerca a las MIPYMES hacia la demanda que hoy está migrando a Internet, y con eso pretendemos mejorar las ventas y el posicionamiento de las empresas pequeñas.
As we look to the future, the Executive Secretariat for Integral Development will continue to leverage cooperation and partnerships to expand our reach, proving that together we are much more than the sum of our 34 member states.
Me and my kids have been there for over an year right now. And children are friends. It doesn't matter where they come from.
Nosotros estamos en una zona netamente selvática. La línea de adyacencia va desde el norte hasta el sur, va desde Modesto Méndez hasta Aguas Turbias, tanto en el norte como en el sur. Esta línea tiene 215 kilómetros de extensión.
De allí vino él, se buscó creo con los de la OAS y de allí vino el proyecto para acá, para Judá. Y fue que lo dieron el terreno, lo dieron todo lo que era mano de obra y el material para hacer las casas que están ahorita. Y por ese motivo estamos aquí viviendo todavía.
La misión continúa trabajando en la implementación de medidas de fomento de la confianza mientras se aguarda el resultado del reclamo que está atendiendo la Corte Internacional de Justicia por la disputa marítima, territorial e insular. Nuestra oficina en la zona de adyacencia realiza verificaciones a solicitud de ambos gobiernos, facilita reuniones y patrullajes conjuntos entre las Fuerzas Armadas y promueve una cultura de paz y cooperación entre las comunidades locales.
Children will be children. And they have harmony. They don't see each other as a different country, but they see each other that they're growing together.
Este video fue producido con la ayuda financiera de la Unión Europea.
Hoy, esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos no podemos ser neutrales.
More than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
SETI's results for 2018 proves our effectiveness as a development partner, placing people at the center of our work and leveraging partnerships and cooperation to transform policy imperatives into action. With an eye on the rapidly changing global context, SETI is innovating to constructively address the emerging challenges and opportunities for the region. As part of our competitiveness program, SETI is designing precise tools to assess assets and capabilities in the productive sector to determine paths towards higher value goods and services. As our flagship program for partnerships, the Americas Competitiveness Exchange on Innovation and Entrepreneurship, the ACE, will continue to leverage good practices and the power of networks to increase trade and investment in the region.
For us, the role of the OAS is very important, connecting countries, connecting governments and private sector. and letting us know what other countries are doing it and how we can replicate that in our countries to enhance development.
For me, who has come here to look at how can we develop our own ecosystem, our own innovation hubs, our own accelerators, I think seeing this, touching, feeling, seeing the transformation, seeing how quickly you made it happen is a testament to what is possible. So I believe all of us leave here stronger than ever.
The Working Group of Experts on Subnational Competitiveness, the GTEX, is our gateway program to promote local economic competitiveness policies alongside municipal and state-level governments, together with the private sector and academia.
Este tipo de reuniones te sirven para darte cuenta de todo lo que se está viviendo en América Latina sobre los temas de competitividad. Y hoy justamente en este sector estamos viendo sobre todo los temas de innovación tecnológica, pues que si hablamos de competitividad tenemos que hablar de tecnología. Y me está ayudando mucho para ver el panorama de ver lo que están haciendo otras ciudades y lo que podemos llegar a aplicar también nosotros en México.
The Hub on the Transfer and Commercialization of Technology is strengthening national innovation ecosystems by training budding entrepreneurs to take promising products and services from idea to market.
¿Por qué es importante que estemos juntos en esto? Porque la región tiene que estar unida y me parece que hay mucho conocimiento en la región que todavía no está explotado comercialmente como podría ser, y esta es la mejor manera de hacerlo.
Tenemos la proyección de cada año generar y compartir nuevas experiencias entre aquellos que contribuyen a la innovación. Queremos cambiar el cómo lo hemos estado haciendo en Latinoamérica. Queremos generar la unión de los países, queremos colaborar.
Our virtual platform on technology foresight, Prospecta Americas, will support OAS member states in identifying and mapping future trends and technological development of critical importance for the Americas.
Este esfuerzo, el cual viene siendo apoyado por la Organización de los Estados Americanos, nos permitirá tener una gran información para poder mapear estas iniciativas de innovación y poder que ellas contribuyan al crecimiento económico, a la competitividad y al bienestar de nuestras naciones.
Como bien sabemos, nos encontramos ya en la cuarta revolución industrial, la que está cambiando rápidamente la forma en que se hace negocio, se produce, se consume y se genera bienestar y entretenimiento en el mundo. Es la mayor amenaza, tal vez la mejor oportunidad que tenemos en nuestras naciones.
The Inter-American Teacher Education Network, the I-10, is working to improve the quality of teachers with an emphasis on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education. In 2019, the I-10 launched the first STEM Teacher Fellowship of the Americas. The Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas, ECPA, is working with governments in the Caribbean to advance electric mobility and clean transport as the sub-region pursues energy independence. Under our Integrated Water Resource Management Program, SETI is responding to the demand for platforms and applications that capture and disseminate real-time information. This includes the expansion of Costa Rica's Plataforma Interactiva de Aplicación del Clima Tropical to the rest of Central America to help build resilient agriculture. The Inter-American Committee on Ports is building human and institutional capacity through public-private partnerships to address port modernization, logistics, and security. CooperaNet, SETI's multi-stakeholder platform for cooperation and partnerships, is being relaunched in 2019, responding to member states' call for a more robust hub for cooperation. As more consumers begin or end their shopping process online, SETI has entered into a partnership with the private sector to digitize millions of micro, small, and medium enterprises across the region.
Las buenas noticias es que sabemos por qué están fracasando, porque no son visibles. Y el hecho de que ahora lo puedan ser, haciéndolo ellas mismas, no solamente rompemos las tres barreras del tiempo, conocimiento y dinero, sino que les permitimos tener éxito y dejar de fracasar a los porcentajes que lo hacen ahora.
Es una herramienta que sin duda acerca a las MIPYMES hacia la demanda que hoy está migrando a Internet y con eso pretendemos mejorar las ventas y el posicionamiento de las empresas pequeñas.
As we look to the future, the Executive Secretariat for Integral Development will continue to leverage cooperation and partnerships to expand our reach, proving that together we are much more than the sum of our 34 member states.
Video message. Ms. Elvia Duque, Latin American Program Officer at the International Institute on Race, Equality, and Human Rights. And we must also acknowledge our virtual audience, including members of civil society joining us by Facebook this morning. A very pleasant good morning to you. And I must say it's a lovely day because I can see a bright sunshiny day outside. In celebration of the 4th Inter-American Week for People of African Descent in the Americas, I'm pleased to commence this virtual forum, which is being held under the week's theme, Ending Slavery's Legacy of Racism, the imperative for strengthening justice and resilience in Afro-descendant communities in the Americas in the face of COVID-19. This seminal week was established by the OAS member states in February 2018 to remember the legacy of slavery and the slave trade and their consequences on the lives of Afro-descendants, while also fostering greater awareness and respect for the diversity of the heritage and culture of people of African descent and their contribution to the development of society and to human development more generally. This past year has been a trying time for the global community as we continue to confront the impact of the global pandemic. In response to our new work reality, the OAS has migrated successfully, I should say, to a virtual platform in continuance of its work to promote the issues of importance to its member states and to the peoples of the Americas. In this context, all of the activities for this year's Inter-American Week have been virtually included. The special meeting of the Permanent Council of the OAS to commemorate the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, a virtual art exhibition in collaboration with the Art Museum of the Americas, a workshop on Afro-identity and culture, as well as cultural events hosted by our country offices. And I am told that those came off very successfully. The theme for this year's Inter-American Week, which was chosen within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and its many attendant issues, reflects the mounting call for the eradication of structural racism faced by Afro-descendants and the urgent need for the implementation of measures to build resilience and promote the equality of rights of persons of African descent. Today's forum culminates this commemorative week and serves to offer insight and insightful presentations from our distinguished panelists on the issues confronting Afro-descendants in our hemisphere. Without further ado, it is my honor to offer the floor to Ambassador Maria del Carmen Roqueberg, Chair of the Permanent Council of the OAS and Permanent Representative of Panama to the OAS, who will deliver welcoming remarks. And by the way, my name is Ian Edwards, and I'm with the OAS General Secretariat. Ambassador Roqueberg, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, esteemed moderator. It's an honor to have you here at this forum with which we are trying to close a very successful week. Ambassadors, permanent representatives before the OAS, Secretary General of the OAS, Luis Almagro, Assistant Secretary General, Ambassador Nestor Mendez, ladies and gentlemen, panelists, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and thank you for being with us today. This is the 4th year that the Organization of American States celebrates the Inter-American Week of the Afro-descendants of the Americas. The main objective of the organization in holding this celebration this week is to focus on the strategic line of action recognizing or acknowledgement of the Plan of Action of the Decade of the Afro-Descendants of the Americas 2016-2025, adopted during the GA of the OAS in 2016. The Plan of Action was developed to support the declaration of the International Decade of Afro-Descendants of the UN 2015-2024, focused on the specific circumstances of Afro-descendants in the Americas, and 2020, the commemoration of this week, that is with the topic facing together, tackling together the legacy of racism and slavery in the Americas, had to be changed owing to the pandemic this year, even though we won't commemorate this week in person. We have held a series of events over the course of the week to reflect on the situation of Afro-descendant peoples in the Americas, taking into account especially the differentiated effects that COVID has wrought on this population, as well as the hurricanes and storms, tropical storms that have befallen Central America and the Caribbean, as well as demands for rights and social justice carried out in many countries, and the regrettable events that led that affected Afro-descendant men and women. So this fight this year, and that continues on, is the result of the persistent effects of the institution of slavery, which has put a good part of this population at a disadvantage in tackling social, environmental, economic challenges to recover from the effects of the pandemic. Natural disasters, I will just to mention a few, will take time, but we do know that it will take even longer for populations that are historically in a position of vulnerability, such as Afro-descendants. That's why it's absolutely necessary for us to carry out actions, for each one of our states carried actions, to commit to these actions along with the work of this organization, for us to ensure that Afro-descendants, ladies and gentlemen, not be left behind anymore, that their rights be fully upheld, and that they never have to suffer any inequality because of the color of their skin. That is our commitment by following through with the mandates established in the Plan of Action, which will contribute to building more resilient communities and grant Afro-descendants access to tools in the Americas with which they will be able to tackle or rise to the challenges, economic, social, environmental, and health challenges caused by COVID-19. So to that effect, I would like to thank the contributions made by the permanent missions of Canada, the US, the DR, whose support has made it possible for us to carry out this forum, which brings together a diverse group of panelists with whom we will delve into these topics. They will share their experiences with us, so as a region we can take stock of everything that happened in 2020, which has been a turning point in everyone's lives, but especially in the lives of Afro-descendants in the Americas. And that will enable us to look forward with concrete proposals to overcome inequalities. That's the only way we will achieve a prosperous future with equal access for all to rights. Before concluding, I would just like to thank and recognize the Assistant Secretary General, Nestor Mendez, Ambassador Nestor Mendez, his whole team, as well as and especially Kendall Belial for their leadership throughout this week and all of the events held, as well as the Department of Conferences and Meetings, the Secretariat of Access to Rights and Equity, the Inter-American Committee on Women, the Press and Communication Department, and the Art Museum of the Americas for all of your support. So thank you very much, and I hope that this will be a very successful forum. Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador.
Floor to His Excellency Luis Almagro, the Secretary General of the OAS, to deliver the opening remarks. Secretary General Almagro, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you for inviting me to take part in this event. And I offer greetings to the President or Chairman of the Council for all the events successfully carried out this week. We have to put an end to the legacy of slavery in the Americas from all viewpoints, socially, cultural, political. It's necessary for countries of the hemisphere to take on their historic responsibility and the current responsibilities that affirmative actions be adopted to correct this long-standing problem that has affected our society, that we inherited from the colonial period, but that has been reproduced generation after generation. The 2015-2024 International Decade of Afro-Descendants gives us the opportunity each year to take a critical look at the situation of our brethren, Afro-descendant brethren, and we know that the Afro-descendant community is among the hardest hit population by the pandemic. This is a fact that should be cause for us to think further on this. One need look only at any statistic, at ourselves, to know without a doubt that how deeply rooted Afro-descendancy is in us, or any other statistic, for us to see what the level of poverty, extreme poverty, that exists to a greater extent among Afro-descendant populations, and on health. The Afro-descendants are the hardest hit. The same thing happens with levels of illiteracy, access to the labor market, Afro-descendant women as well. The gender and race gap weigh heavily on these two variables. So we were saying at the Permanent Council just yesterday, poverty is Afro-descendant in our continent. Afro-descendants are the main victims of violence that our hemisphere suffers, the most violent hemisphere in the world. Now, the measures taken by governments in the labor market are focused on the formal sectors of the economy, overlooking many informal cases in which there's a greater concentration of Afro-descendant persons, despite the high number of Afro-descendants that live in the Americas. Slowly, their historic demands have been heard, but the structural rights have not been reached by them. There are structural inequalities that persist, discrimination, which has become entirely institutionalized. It's a discrimination that speaks to how the states and its institutions work, that generate and produce this discrimination and inequality. There are still long-lasting figures that show a low level of participation and involvement in decision-making processes, institutional and political bodies, making it that much more difficult to overcome this situation. They don't have representation within the courts. The number of Afro-descendants in the prison system is disproportionately high. Something else that should give us pause and make us think is the fact of the cultural contributions that Afro-descendants have made at all levels of society. The incorporation of the Afro-descendant population within the official histories of the Americas should be made a priority for all ministries of education throughout the region, for all the ministries of culture. The member states of the OAS committed to do that when they adopted the plan of action for Afro-descendants of the OAS. Likewise, we believe that with the signature and ratification of the Inter-American Commission Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, and Related Forms of Intolerance, and the implementation of the plan of action of the Decade of Afro-descendant Men and Women in the Americas by all member states, that we thought would make it possible for us to make a contribution to paying this historic debt toward Afro-descendants. Now, the disproportionate impact on Afro-descendants by COVID makes it a legal imperative that falls to all of the citizens of the Americas to address that disproportionate effect. Thank you very much.
Está mute,
Yeah,
Ian.
you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, Secretary General, for so pointedly identifying the issues that are being addressed and some of the things the OAS is doing. And so with that, as we move now into the presentations, our first presenter is Mrs. Angela Acevedo, Vice Minister for Multicultural Affairs of Peru. I'll just give you a brief outline of Ángela Acevedo Huertas. Es abogada de profesión, cuenta con más de 15 años de experiencia en puestos de...
She is a lawyer by profession, has worked in public administration for many years in prevention, as well as solving social conflicts.
Política. Mrs. Acevedo, you have the floor.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for the diagnosis that Secretary General Magro and Ambassador Roquefort referred to in the historic debt that we have as Latin American countries, given for the development of the Afro-descendant population. Now, it falls to me to talk about the Afro-Peruvian situation in my country, Peru, and I would like to provide you with some information that I think is worthwhile sharing. First, 2017 for the Afro-Peruvian population was a landmark event. There were many years of fight, political fight, and a coordinated effort with state bodies. It was possible for us to include the question of ethnic self-determination within the 2017 census. For the first time, a national census included that question. That question helped us to identify, or rather to have information, that is, to have better information about the Afro-descendant population and to also have information about their socioeconomic situation. Now, in that census, we were able to identify in the snapshot of 2017 that there are 100 million people who self-identify as Peruvian Afro-descendants, and the census also made it possible for us to identify clearly the gaps regarding access that Afro-Peruvian populations have to certain services. Now, we saw that there was a rise of poverty between 2014 and 2019 from 25 to 37, 38% in Afro-descendant homes. And even though the overall poverty dropped, and so you see the Afro-Peruvian population is the one that was hardest hit by poverty. Whereas it's 8 of 10 children finish their education. It's a lower rate for Afro-descendants. In 2019, there's 82%, that is 10 percentage points higher than the average rate. So this vulnerability, as reflected in the percentage of the Afro-descendant population, this isn't something that we only have right now. It's been in place since slavery and for many decades. If we add to that the pandemic, it's a serious situation, as all countries, all of the countries that are facing the pandemic of the coronavirus, the hardest hit are the most vulnerable, in which those people that already had difficulties for access to health, jobs, and they work oftentimes in the informal sector. So that is the situation. And so the Peruvian government, in coordination with Afro-descendant populations, are building the national policy for the Afro-Peruvian peoples, which is based on the experience that we had through the national Afro-Peruvian plan that was put together a few years back, and what we are building now in a participatory and coordinated way with Afro-descendant populations is for there to be one policy, a policy which establishes guidelines, goals, indicators regarding public services geared toward Afro-Peruvian populations. We think that having a managerial instrument that would govern all of the sectors, we then would be able to work on finally closing the gap, this historic gap, and paying this historic debt. It's a very difficult task to achieve equal access to rights. This is something that we should all be committed to. Now, in the next bicentennial of Peru, we believe that the only way to change the situation is to do so together, to work together. The Afro-Peruvian population, civil society, the Peruvian state, different entities. If the pandemic has taught us anything, that the only way out is to pull together, make a concerted effort with an ongoing dialogue, seeking to enhance the situation of our peoples. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Acevedo.
There's some insight into the scenario in Peru. I now welcome Mr. Peter Flagel, Executive Director of the Government of Canada's Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat. Peter Flagel is the Executive Director of the government's Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat, a cornerstone of building a foundation for change, Canada's anti-racism strategy 2019 to 2022. In addition to coordinating federal action and driving the overall strategy, he and his team are responsible for working with the federal government, departments, and agencies to identify and coordinate initiatives, identify gaps, and consider the impacts of new and existing policies, services, and programs on communities and indigenous peoples. It's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Flagel to make his presentation on mobilizing government against systemic anti-Black racism. Mr. Flagel.
Buenos dias, bom dia, bonjour, comment nous y, good morning. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, panelists, let me begin by thanking the Organization of American States for inviting me to speak. Je me joins à vous à partir d'Ottawa, une ville située sur la terre ancestrale non cédée du peuple algonquin Anishinaabeg, qui est également la capitale de mon pays. It is an honor. Ending slavery's legacy of racism. I'm the Executive Director of the Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat, a relatively new directorate within the Government of Canada. By coordinating initiatives across the federal government, my team works with all government departments to eliminate systemic racism, including anti-Black racism, in the policy-making process. Como canadiense, nacido en Haití.
As a Canadian, born in Haiti, the first Latin American country to achieve its independence, I'm a living witness of the strong ties that unite the African traits or features with the Americas.
Canada, like everywhere else in the Americas, saw slavery flourish on its shores. Indigenous and African peoples were enslaved laborers in La Nouvelle-France and in Upper and Lower Canada until emancipation. Unfortunately, slavery's legacy lived on. Racial segregation undermined Black opportunities. Racial violence terrorized Black lives, and systemic racism shackled Black communities to the horrific legacy of slavery. Nonetheless, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge that Canada has also witnessed great strides. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, for example, enshrines in our Constitution the principles of human rights, democratic freedoms, and anti-discrimination for all. And just this week, thanks to the advocacy of countless Black organizations across Canada, our House of Commons voted unanimously to officially designate August 1st as Emancipation Day. So no wonder that Canada's 1.2 million strong Black communities are dynamic, they are resourceful, and they are determined. They are driving innovation in such fields as science, health, the humanities, culture, politics, and economic development like never before. As of this year, Black Canadians aged 25 to 54 are more likely to hold a university degree than are white Canadians. Isso faz parte da resiliência anônima.
And this speaks to the resilience of Afro-descendants in Canada.
Black racism persists. No clearer is this than with a double pandemic of COVID-19 and exacerbated racism. This double pandemic has brought so much devastation to our nation. It has destroyed lives, it has shuttered businesses, and it has exacerbated pre-existing social and economic inequalities. Far from being the great equalizer, COVID-19 has proven that more than 200 years after emancipation, racial inequalities continue to shape life expectancy. Statistics Canada, for example, has shown that in Montreal, our second largest city, neighborhoods with large Black populations have almost twice the COVID-19 mortality rate than those with small ones. And we see this discrepancy, unfortunately, in other major cities. To make things worse, unemployment among Black Canadians has skyrocketed. Yet, Canada has taken decisive steps to tackle systemic racism head-on. In 2019, the government launched Canada's $45 million anti-racism strategy focused on demonstrating federal leadership, empowering communities, and raising awareness and changing attitudes. Dans le cadre de la stratégie, le secrétariat fédéral dirige et coordonne des actions.
Within the framework of that strategy, we are coordinating all of this.
An interdepartmental task force to address the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on equity-deserving populations like Black communities. Through the task force, we have been able to shape COVID-19 emergency response measures, including a $350 million emergency fund for grassroots organizations. Mais ce n'est pas tout. Nous avons également établi un groupe de travail interministériel.
But that's not all. We have an intermaterial working group on persons of African descent.
Flagship programs as the $221 million Black Entrepreneurship Fund. Work is also advancing on justice reform as we collaborate with departments like Justice Canada and Public Safety to tackle systemic barriers in the criminal justice system. While much remains to be done, we do have a solid foundation to ignite broad-based societal change. And judging by last year's massive America's-wide Black Lives Matter protests, there clearly is unprecedented public appetite for lasting change. So Canada is determined to continue working hand in hand with Black communities to eradicate anti-Black racism, promote democratic participation, and secure human rights. Canada also looks forward to working with the Organization of American States to end slavery's legacy of racism by giving new meaning to more rights for more people. As we strive to defend the rules-based international order and champion effective multilateralism, we can be guided by the official theme of Canada's 2021 Black History Month celebration, The Future is Now. L'avenir, c'est maintenant pour que nous ayons de plus amples actions concertées contre le racisme.
The future is now so that we can work more effectively against systemic racism in the Americas.
Derechos de los afrodescendientes sean plenamente reconocidos y respetados.
The future is now so that each Afro-American life can be more respected in more equitable democracies.
Of origin, social class, sexual or gender identity, or ability. Encorajo a todos de aprovechar este momento, because the future is now. L'avenir, c'est maintenant. Merci.
Merci beaucoup.
I thank you very much, Mr. Flegel.
Important initiatives he outlined there, and we, of course, welcome the announcement that Canada will be introducing Emancipation Day, which the Anglophone Caribbean has been observing for some decades now. Thank you. We will now hear a presentation by Mr. Javier Diaz, Director of the Racial Ethics Unit of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Uruguay. Actualmente es representante del Estado a la Comisión Honoraria de Lucha contra.
At the present time, he is representing his state on the Government Committee Against Racism, Xenophobia, and all types of discrimination at the University of the República Oriental de Uruguay. He has a degree in international relations. Pleasure to welcome you, Mr. Diaz. You have the floor. Distinguished Secretary General, distinguished Assistant Secretary General, Madam Chair of the Permanent Council, esteemed colleagues, a very good morning to you all. I'd like to ask, and you see it now on your screens, that we have a presentation here. I'd like to say that on the 25th of June, we will be awarding a prize for Afro-Caribbean women. We have moved quite some distance since we started this. And in that presentation, Ms. Amanda Rora, a woman of Afro-Uruguayan descent, will be heading up that third conference, or headed up, I should say, I beg your pardon, the third conference, World Conference Against Racism back in Durban. We know that the violation of rights begins at an early age, at the school, and of course, it is reinforced right and left, the more so when the parents of the children are of very limited economic resources. Very often there is an abysmal lack of recognition of differences, which is a quiet discrimination. And that discrimination is felt very personally, above and beyond structural racism that stems from the situation of poverty of many of these young people. We hope to address this inequality, and for that purpose, we have brought in all of the state entities above and beyond the present ones. We have the Department on Afro-Descendants and the Social Development and Racial Ethnic Unity of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We have under Law 19-122 a series of affirmative actions. And there is a roadmap to try to break this set of reinforcing discriminatory measures. At the continental level, at the hemispheric level, we have also acted. At the pre-regional conference that was held in Santiago, Chile, December 2000, a program and a plan of action was drawn up to present to Durban in 2001. And let us not forget the decade for Afro-descendants, 2015-2024. But it bears saying that elements of democracy, of equity and justice, and a better understanding of these concepts are essential. It is a complex situation. And in the face of COVID-19, it hasn't become any simpler. But we know that a number of diseases have existed for centuries with unequal defense and protection. And we know that today, as we move on at another level, social networks have also reinforced and indeed broadened the grip of racism. It's important to have very, very vigilant attitudes towards all types of attacks that can, in fact, affect the population. Let me give you, just in the area of the sports world, a couple of examples that go to the repercussions of virtual social networks. In July 2020, September 2020, that first one is Mexico. You can see it here in the US, November 2020 in Argentina, 8 February, Uruguay. There has been a slew of instances of racism that have affected Afro-descendants. Now, there are many different types of discrimination that can be made felt. And it is felt even in the alerts against the pandemic. Clearly, the murder of George Floyd has resonated everywhere. And what we see, because of the impact of COVID in the short and medium term is again the impact of education and or the lack thereof because of lack of connectivity in times when people are having to study at home, work from home as well. Clearly, it is the Afro-descendant sphere of the population that is regularly the hardest hit. Now, 20 years after the important conference in Durban, we see how important it is that the Summit of Young People has been a salient example of increasing awareness. And it has touched on an array of areas. The acceptance on the part of states and society in general of the fact that the slave trade and its ongoing impact is certainly a step forward. The determination to face racism head on needs to be continually reinforced. There are existing gaps for Afro-descendant citizens in this hemisphere, and these need to be recognized not only here, but internationally. We see the ratification of the Inter-American Convention Against Racism of the member states as another example of a step forward. But finally, it's important that we understand that Afro-descendants have been protagonists in our march forward. And of course, they are increasingly hampered because of health restrictions that affect them the most. Thank you very much, Mr. Diaz.
The renowned Costa Rican writer and educator, Duncan ha sido profesor y director de varios centros educativos, tales como
Mr. Moody has been head of St. Clair, Worcester College, and head of the Costa Rican University. He's been visiting professor in Alabama, Indiana University, University of Pennsylvania, and Purdue University in the United States.
Speak to the urgent need for inclusive education for Afro-descendant children. And his title, he's given it, La urgencia de una educación inclusiva para los niños afrodescendientes.
The title is The Urgency of an Inclusive Curriculum for Afro-descendant Children. You have the floor, sir. I'd like to begin by expressing a very respectful greeting to Madam Chair, Permanent Council, indeed also to the Secretary General and the Assistant Secretary General of this organization, the ambassadors, the distinguished panelists, and esteemed guests who are joining us in this virtual forum. Yes, indeed, I think it is abundantly clear that an inclusive curriculum that is tailored to the needs of Afro-descendant children is of the essence. Why is that? Why, quite simply because the Afro-descendant child, from the first days of schooling, faces a biased and a dominant culture, in some cases idealizing the indigenous past, the Mayans, the Aztecs, the Incans, while at the same time marginalizing and degrading the contemporary indigenous person. This sets up a very mixed message, and it continually belittles the contribution of Black communities in the construction of the nations. The old and later discredited idea of Arnold Toynbee's, which he himself discarded at the end of his life, was that Blacks represented the only race that had never contributed at all to the development of universal civilization. Well, that idea fell from its own weight. And yet, the shadow that that notion has cast continues to be felt in our countries. Now, if we take into account that historical background and look at the position of the little boy or girl of Afro-descendant, we see that there is a deafening silence that comes from the stereotypical representation of that race in the school manuals. And the same goes for brown persons. And you can see this in its most grotesque caricature during the blackface era. All of this, ladies and gentlemen, is a tremendous blow to the self-esteem of the Afro-descendant child. It also influences little boys and girls who may be mostly white or mixed race, but it is a trap for them all, and particularly, I say again, for Afro-descendants and indigenous children, who evidently take in the message that they are the inferior race and the others are the superior race. The present curriculum, through this ongoing exclusion and the rendering invisible of these children, is still pernicious. Many of these children have absolutely taken in these stereotypes that are ridiculous, that are exclusive, and that block their understanding of their own worth. And that is because this ongoing presumed desire for inclusion does not fully understand the roots that I have just explained. And participation, by the way, should not be limited to the stereotypical family or a particular phenotype or the most popular forms of cultural stereotypes. When the Afro-descendant child continues to be rendered invisible, not only he or she is invisible, but so too his or her ascendants, those who led to that person's position. It is a complete ignorance of the many ways in which the Afro-descendant peoples have very richly contributed to the wealth of our nations and to their cultures. And it feeds into the degrading and ongoing ridiculous popular imaginary stereotypes. And so we push for a new curriculum, ladies and gentlemen, a fresh start understanding where we went wrong and for how long. Put differently, we need to take a huge leap in favor of true civilization, of inclusive generation that is ethical, that is inclusive, and that is respectful of history above all. One that will take into account intercultural competence and that will directly fight negative stigmas, certainly hoping to eliminate them. This means that there has to be ongoing participation of the teachers of the entire professorial body. Now, I have met throughout Latin America very sensitive and very brilliant teachers who are completely open to the points I've made, and others that are quite frankly and openly racist. Therefore, and I say this to all, including the teaching profession, we need to raise the banner of unity and diversity throughout the hemisphere. Thank you very much. I thank you very much, Professor Duncan Moody.
Presentation there, among other things, calling for a new curriculum to redress some of the issues identified. Before introducing our next presenter, I must acknowledge the presence of Jamaica's delegation in this forum. I'm not sure what other delegations may be present. I'm now pleased to share a video presentation by Afro-Mexican representatives from the National Institute of Indigenous Peoples of Mexico.
La población de origen africano hemos estado presentes en México desde la llegada de los.
We Afro-descendants have been present in Mexico from the time when the Spanish arrived in the country. Since then, we have contributed unceasingly to building this nation. Nonetheless, a recognition of the Afro-descendant contribution is marked with racism and discrimination. The more so, since it is, as has just been mentioned, from the earliest years of schooling that sometimes latent racism is absolutely reinforced and perpetuated. We stand for the effort to break through these historic and cultural barriers which continue to hold us back, because those who arrived as a result of the slave trade in the era of the colonies have worked hard in the mines, in the fields, and elsewhere to raise up the country we see today. But we need to fight against the crime against humanity that we have all suffered. And yet we are so often rendered invisible, as has just been mentioned. And Dr. Leticia Alfonso, in the prologue to her book, The Black Peoples of Mexico, says as much. It's important that these facts be recognized and that the Black population in Mexico be offered conditions of equality and no longer held to be invisible. This means, bluntly, that no one should have to simply take it when there is prejudice and hostility. It's important to work nonetheless against it. And I, as a Black woman, very much aware of discrimination and racism, have lived in historic moments of our struggle for greater respect to be earned by the Black peoples of Mexico. And I understand that it is racism and racialist attitudes that are at the root of this. And where do they come? They come from the very basis of the founding of the country, and they infiltrate all levels and aspects of interpersonal relations. We have got to tear the veil off to show racism for what it is. And that's what we're engaged in doing. Another point, of course, is to move to empower Afro-descendant women. And we know that the challenge is high, but that's just too bad. We will not stop. We will not cease in our struggle against racism and discrimination. And further, we dare to dream that there are better days ahead. I'm Anaí Herrera. As an Afro-Mexican, I speak of the racial discrimination and injustice I have suffered. And in the face of COVID-19, let me say, those inequalities have only deepened. It's very hard to be quarantined, to be told to stay at home when it is animal husbandry, fishing, and field activities that are our greatest source of income. And those are precisely the ones one cannot, of course, be employed in when we're stuck at home. And if we step out, of course, we will be in communication with people of other ethnic backgrounds, which is why it's important that we fine-tune our community, our communication strategies, rather. Personally, if I may simply say, all of this affected me greatly because everything that I could have done to help boys and girls, young people and women that are in vulnerable situation are all activities that have come to a dead stop. And as we know, the danger to women is increasingly dangerous and perilous. My name is Dema Bernal Juarez. I am proud to call myself an Afro-Mexican. I have suffered racial discrimination, but there's another, it's a double whammy, because those of us who are young are discounted. What do you have to contribute? Well, we do. And we need to fight for space in which we young people can speak up and speak out. It's important that we embrace our Afro-Mexican identity for what it is. and proudly. For that, of course, I understand we need to work on it, to find means of communication. I, for the longest time, straightened my hair. God forbid I should look to be African. Well, that's in the past. And this is something we need to pass on to both our boys and girls. We're also suffering greatly from COVID-19. Afro-Mexican populations have regularly suffered from lack of connectivity. We certainly do not all have access to internet. Those who do are few and far between, and such as that connectivity is, quite frankly, it's not that good and constantly interrupted. So too the challenge to keep studying, and so to work hard to close the gap of inequality. We understand there has to be a public effort so to do. There has to be an education that is gender and culturally sensitive. I am Beatriz Amaro Clemente. As those who have spoken before me, it is clear that racism in Mexico is institutional, structural, and systemic. It manifests itself socioculturally, statistically, and legally with regard to the Afro-descended populations. The 2020 census shows that 2% of the population sees themselves as Afro-descendants. That's 2.5 million people, by the way, of whom 1.3 million are women, and I am one. The communities that have Afro-descended population are generally along the coast of Guerrero and Oaxaca on the Pacific. And these communities are an absolute example of discrimination, of cradles of emigration, racked with violence, where women generally are left alone, and where it comes to health in these eras of the pandemic, there is simply no disaggregated set of data that speak to the situation of Afro-Mexican women who have been affected by COVID-19, nor certainly any means of tackling that other pandemic, that ongoing and insidious pandemic, which is the permanent violence that is visited upon us, ladies and gentlemen. And therefore, we demand full constitutional recognition. We are subjects worthy of full public recognition and full rights, guaranteeing the effective exercise of our fundamental freedoms, and these must be promoted and protected, particularly in this era of a pandemic where racism and the fight against women need to be seen as further plights, as the Convention of Belém do Pará sets forth in very pertinent detail. We want to stop being invisible. That's the sum and essence of it. Thank you.
Nuestros agradecimientos a las representantes afro-mexicanas por esas.
Thank you very much to the Afro-Mexican citizens from Mexico who have spoken to us.
Latin American Program Officer at the International Institute on Race, Equality, and Human Rights. Elvia works on advocacy projects within the sphere of the OAS, principally in favor of the ratification of the Inter-American Convention Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, and related forms of intolerance. In introducing my friend Elvia, her presentation will cover the theme A Year Later, COVID-19 and Afro-Descendants in Latin America. Un año después, la COVID-19 y
1 year later, after the start of COVID and Afro-Descendant population jump. Thank you. I have a PowerPoint presentation. If you could put that up on the screen, please. I would just like to take this opportunity to thank the public listening in to this webinar, speakers, experts, ambassadors present, and of course, the organizers of the event. As you said, I'm Elvia Duque, the Program Officer for Latin America on Race and Equality, Institute of Race, Equality, and Human Rights. Now, this presentation has a regional focus, and as you said, I am focusing on 1 year on COVID in Latin America and the Afro-descendant population. It seems very important for me to start my presentation with what I call Afro-descendant voices, because I think that oftentimes we take a cold and technical look at these matters, and it's important to hear from the grassroots, from activists working to protect people's communities at the risk of their own lives. I'm going to provide information, which is information gathered between 2020 and 21 during the different venues that we have opened to discuss this subject matter within our organization, because the pandemic, as everyone has said, all of the panelists who spoke before me have said, highlighted the cruelty of structural racism in Latin America, regardless of the socio-political models in any given country. So this problem is much deeper than states acknowledge. It also underscored the lack of state solutions in keeping with the socioeconomic reality of the vast majority of the population in the region, especially the Afro-descendant peoples. The quarantines or confinement or lockdown and biosecurity plans have that people are called upon to comply with, they simply cannot comply with. Now, also the lack of prevention programs or assistance for Afro-descendant persons is something else I'd like to focus on. These are the poorest of the poorest Afro-descendants, and so the rebuilding plans for the economy are excluding them, or budgets aren't being, line items aren't being created for them. For what was also made starkly clear is there's a rise of violence and persecution of activists and human rights defenders of Afro-descendant rights. Between 2020 and 2021 in different countries, a number of human rights defenders have been murdered, and the courts do next to nothing. In the case of Colombia, activists are terrorized by the National Unit of Protection, and there's even a precautionary measure that's been issued by the IA, or the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, against Colombia for this. There's a lack of statistical information about the pandemic among the Afro-descendant population. We need to have clear information for us to properly assist this population, and we have to wait for the census to be carried out every 10 years. There's a need for there to be national, regional, international measures of protection and promotion taken. Now, if we want to underscore that women, young people, migrants, LGBTIQ persons of Afro-descendants, who are Afro-descendants, suffer harder with greater inequalities, the impacts of the pandemic. That's something we've seen much of this year: abuse of power, family violence, and so forth. 1 year on, the demands of the Afro-descendant people continue to be rendered invisible. Their socioeconomic situation suffers, as well as their rights. Afro-descendants are excluded from measures taken to help people in the midst of the COVID pandemic. It's not too late for states to adopt actions and to hold events such as this, which are key to raise awareness among states. That's why I thank you for taking this opportunity to promote this type of activity. It's necessary for states to come up with mechanisms to offer help in an equitable way. Large companies, multimillionaires, are getting rich during the pandemic, and the poor are getting poorer. and there should be measures adopted to help the people who need it most. Now, our team has come up with 7 recommendations, the first of which is that we need to create structural racism. That is what has led us to the current situation that we face. Post-COVID emergency plans need to be created that are geared toward the Afro-descendant communities in the rural and urban environments, respecting the right to consultation and consent, prior and consent, taking into account all the different intersectional places across all levels of government, because we cannot continue waiting every 10 years for the census to be done to gather this information. There has to be better statistical information gathered across the government. We have to identify and strengthen successful experiences among Afro-descendants and hold them up as examples to be followed. Last, to ensure the protection of human rights defenders of Afro-descendants or Afro-descendant human rights defenders and champions, and to swiftly respond and appropriately respond to their requests to document violations of socioeconomic, cultural, and political rights. There should be created the economic fund within the OAS for Afro-descendants, the effective implementation of the International Decade for Afro-descendants, Agenda 2030, the plan of action of the Decade of Afro-descendants of the Americas, 2016-2015, strengthening the rapporteurship on the rights of Afro-descendant persons and against racial discrimination. This is the rapporteurship that is least funded within the IACHR, and that makes no sense. And the Inter-American Convention Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, or related forms of intolerance, OAS, needs to be signed and ratified. Thank you. I thank everyone who has taken the time to hear me and that has made this event possible.
A presentation that gives us an overview of the status of this thing. Of course, we want to acknowledge all the delegations. Actually, virtually all delegations are now connected, including some who are connected as viewers on this forum. Our hearty thank you to all the panelists for the informative presentations, which we hope will provide a better understanding of the issues facing Afro-descendants in the Americas. And importantly, of course, we've been given some insights into what's being done, but also what else can be done. And I'm sure people are also thinking in, in terms of going forward, how to better act and measures that are needed to change the reality for the better. I now wish to offer the floor to any questions or comments by member states. This can be facilitated by requesting the floor on the Kudo platform if you are registered as a participant in this event, or you can share your question or comment via the Kudo chat box. We're also monitoring the Facebook broadcast because we also had indicated at the beginning that it's being streamed live on Facebook. Our first contribution will be courtesy of the Permanent Mission of Argentina to the OAS via a video.
Welcome, Ambassador. Maria Fernandez Silva, Ambassador from Argentina at the Holy See, and it's a pleasure for me to be a part of this special forum today. We've been in office for only a year, but this year we do have some things we'd like to tell you about as regards measures taken. Our president, Dr. Alberto Fernandez, showed his commitment in the fight against discrimination as a candidate, and in his first speech to the National Assembly said, discrimination in Argentina has to become unforgivable. This was what he said in the first speech also at the United Nations. Then, shortly thereafter, I was appointed, which I also see as a anti-racial or anti-racist, rather, public policy. I am the first female ambassador of my country at the Holy See, and the president took the bold decision to, in addition to appointing a woman for the first time, he appointed one of mixed race. So this is also an anti-racist policy. I'm the first Afro-Argentine person to rise to the level of an ambassador in my country. It's important because it's collective, it's community. It's important because it could only happen within the context of a popular, national, and democratic government or administration. Afro-Argentineness is thus translated into action this way. Now, regarding terminology that I saw used in one of the programs I saw in anticipation of today, there was enslavement, not slavery. There were the enslaved. And so I would firmly and fondly ask you to adapt your language, a racist language, because to point out slaves is to point out that someone was born a slave, and that actually hides those who were responsible. So there weren't slaves, there were enslaved people. There wasn't slavery, there was enslavement. Otherwise, you would be whitewashing the crime of abduction, of transatlantic slave trade. That said, I'm pleased to also comment that in our country, our government, we've created the National Commission for the Historic Recognition of the Afro-Argentine community. And, truth be told, this is truly historical, a historical commission, and it is headed up by an Afro-Argentine, which fills us with pride and happiness. In the case of my country, our community is rife with the problem of denial, of rendering the Afro-descendant community invisible. These are historically deeply entrenched, rooted forms of discrimination. We are going down the path within the Republic of Argentina. We still have a long way to go, but we are just continuing with what was started by the administration of the Kirchners, Fernando and Cristina, former presidents. So I would be remiss if I weren't to say that we are just a few hours from celebrating the National Day of Memory that recalls the victims of the last military dictatorship. Memory, justice, these are principles that are tied to, inextricably tied to the condition of being an Afro-descendant in Argentina. There, among the 30,000 people who were disappeared, there were Afro-descendants, and we demand for our whole entire community memory, truth, and justice. So the Pope, in his last social encyclical, said that racism is a virus that easily mutates, and instead of disappearing, remains hidden, and it needs to be vanquished. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Good morning. Thank you. That is
Argentina to the Holy See. We have Mr. Luis Maldonado representing Ecuador. Is he there? Mr. Maldonado? Yes, he's connecting.
good morning. Thank you very much. We would like to start by congratulating everyone and greeting you on behalf of the Ecuadorian government for holding this very important forum with the objective of putting an end to racism. I think that this is a transcendental event that makes it possible for us to continue to champion and defend the rights of Afro-descendants in the Americas. I would like to talk about the progress made in our country regarding public policies. First, it's important to underscore that the Ecuadorian Constitution, the new Constitution of Ecuador of 2008, defines Ecuador as a constitutional state of rights. The state is ultimately the exercise of rights and should ensure and uphold rights that is enshrined in the fundamental law. In Article 1, it defines Ecuador as a plurinational, intercultural state. Article 58, regarding the Afro-Ecuadorian population, says to strengthen their cultural identity, traditions, and rights. The Afro-Ecuadorian community is recognized and their collective rights are recognized, and that includes a heading of 21 rights that are recognized for all of the different peoples, nationalities of Ecuador. I should also say that this constitution recognizes or grants constitutional status to all those international human rights agreements. That means that the Constitution is a key tool for the administration of justice and rights in Ecuador. %21% of the population of Ecuador are comprised by peoples, indigenous and Afro-Ecuadorian populations. Of that 21%, 7.2% represents Afro-Ecuadorian population. The Afro-Ecuadorian population is characterized, that is, there are ancestral lands that they have inhabited along the coast mostly over the last half century. As well as in the urban centers, especially Guayaquil, one of the main cities of Ecuador. In 2009, the plurinational plan to eliminate racial discrimination and ethnic and cultural exclusion was enacted, which calls for public policies to be jointly adopted to combat racism and discrimination, especially focused on justice, legislation, cross-cutting nature of rights, citizen participation, strengthening institutions, international relations. In 2014, which was declared the International Decade of Afro-Descendants, and that was adopted as a public policy through a executive decree 915, and the National Council for the Equality of Peoples and Nationalities. It was appointed to be the coordinator of the process of implementation of that plan or international decade. So we also have the process of institutionalizing the respect and upholding of collective rights as enshrined in the Constitution. A subsecretary of nationalities and peoples was created that seeks to implement programs, plans, projects, policies to promote and undertake actions aimed at strengthening and developing the different indigenous nationalities and Afro-descendants. That is the body within which we have been working on undertaking different actions, carrying out interinstitutional efforts to ensure compliance with these rights and the collective rights of indigenous peoples. Through this body, we also promote that same year a national agenda for equality of Afro-Ecuadorians and of indigenous peoples, as well as putting together plans. This is what has been done within the public sphere in Ecuador, and we hope that in the next administration, because we are engaged in the electoral process, the elections will be held on November 11th, and so those demands that we have made of the candidates to the presidency of the Republic have been included in a proposal that we have provided them with. Thank you very much. I thank you for your remarks. On behalf of Ecuador, I reiterate the invitation of the delegates of member states who would like to comment or add any viewpoints. We are also taking comments on Facebook. Any comment to be made by the public can go to Facebook if you would like. Now, I am going to read a comment that we received via Facebook. Warm greetings from Mexico City to the Permanent Council of the OAS, Hector Zúñiga Vargas. This is one of the comments that we received via Facebook. Someone else referred to the very worthy representatives of the Afro-Mexican population. Dr. Quince Duncan's presentation was wonderful. Warm greetings from Mexico. Julian Acevedo. These were the comments that we received thus far via Facebook. And I would just reiterate that we have opened the floor for comments by member states of the OAS who are on the Quito platform, if anyone would like to ask for the floor.
Comment. So if there's anybody, or if any of the presenters we had wish to make any brief additional points to any of the presentations or comment on any, we can do that as well, since we, as of now, we're not seeing any requests to speak. Anybody? Okay, let's see here. Okay, Mr. Duncan is requesting to speak. Yes, Professor Duncan.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Me parece
Thank you very much. Now, I think it's important to say that there was much agreement regarding the educational aspect. I was happy to hear that a number of speakers from Mexico and elsewhere were adamant about this, and something that the OAS could do, in my view, and it would be great if we could achieve this, is to try to influence, to see if any type of agreement or convention on education could be drafted to get states to take on, in a very open way, this topic of education, to commit to it, to do so in a very balanced way among the different national educational programs that already exist, that we not continue using, for example, this approach we see throughout Latin America, in which we have a pyramid. During the colonial period, in which you had the Spaniards on top, then the church, white people, and then you go down to the base of the pyramid, where the indigenous or black populations are, depending on the given country, in a subjugated position. So Afro-descendants, black people who contributed to building the nation are overlooked. And that is the message we are giving our young people, the same message, to say that the only thing that has happened in your group is that you were slaves, as our colleague said earlier, that they were enslaved by someone, not slaves by nature. And so I do think it's important to bring pressure to bear for the ministries of education to start to tackle this situation head on if we want to solve this problem. Because the problem is twofold. You've got the external aspect, which is this message of domination, of subjugation, and then you have the internal part of the message, which is if the population that is subject to this bad education is actually swallowing, taking on this example that is being essentially foisted upon them. So peoples who were enslaved, who or are being presented as slaves, or descendants of slaves, as opposed to, and also the model that's being sold and taught is that there is a superior dominant race. Now, in Costa Rica, in a paper, there was a supplement for children that it went so far as to say this, speaking of primitive and superior races, pointing out how the primitive races were in Africa and Australia, and the superior races and so forth. And that's not something that has been here or that just came up. It comes from Hegel and the European Enlightenment. And so those European and racist ideas have been incorporated by people, and people need to take a hard look at that legacy and confront it. You were referring to that newspaper supplement. What was the public reaction to that supplement? Well, at the time that was published, our reaction was the same that those of us who are engaged in this activity always have. only we reacted. The population at large did not react. Now, there was a book that was used for fourth graders, a textbook in which, among other things, the black person had, he was always mulling over thoughts that were darker than his skin. That's how it was put in this textbook. These are controversial matters that surface every so many years. It's cyclical. That was 4 years back. And then there was a reaction by the establishment. People who aren't from our community say, listen, yes, you're right. This does have racist overtones, connotations. It needs to be changed. And so then the education ministry, as it was taken up at a higher level, then a more thoughtful approach to textbook writing was adopted. Ultimately, that will be eliminated, but that was a belated reaction. We always hear the history books talk about the Spanish conquest, and thank goodness, thank God, that that's how it happened. Thank you, Professor. And now, another comment from Elvia Duque.
Perdón. Yes, thank you very much indeed. I always struggle with the video, but here we are. To begin with, let me say again what a pleasure it has been to listen to the Honorable Prince Duncan. It is a true privilege to share this space with him, and indeed I say the same with regard to my sisters from Mexico. We are true counterparts. And if you ask for any additional comment, let me simply say this. The OAS has various fora that should be strengthened. One, as I said earlier, regards the rapporteurship on Afro-descendants and against racial discrimination within the Commission. And that obviously is a very promising venue, it goes without saying. But unfortunately, it hasn't really been sufficiently funded. And it is important, I believe, that there be an ongoing dialogue between that rapporteurship and all entities within the OAS broadly. And of course, we also have the important Convention Against Racism and all related forms of discrimination, because we need to push, to encourage, to exhort, choose whatever verb you want, to get states to subscribe to the aforementioned convention. We've got to get it to be ratified and to be implemented. You know what? It's a beautiful text. It's tremendous, very stirring literature, particularly if we compare it with some that have been written within the UN. But that's not good enough. It's got to come into force. It has been ratified by some, but alas, not by enough. And we need to push resolutely toward greater ratification and finally implementation. You know, things aren't perfected until they're used. And if that's not happening, you got to ask yourself, gee, what's wrong? What do we need to do differently? That's what I wanted to say.
Assessment there, Elvia. And it seems that we have no further public comment, nor from the member states, I presume. So at this point, we will move into the closing session.
Ian, tenemos a Díaz de Uruguay pidiendo la palabra.
Okay, we have.
I wanted to add to what Professor Duncan was just saying a minute ago, and I could not agree more with him. What is most important is for each of us in our own country to build models and to offer positive role models to our young people within the educational system And furthermore, there needs to be a public awareness campaign, I think, throughout the hemisphere, big time. And I say that needs to be hemisphere-wide. There needs also to be increased bilateral and indeed multilateral intervention and cooperation in order to spur the system, the Inter-American system, to do what needs to be done to make a difference here. You know, the Afro-descendants, the year of Afro-descendants came and went. We're now at a hemispheric level, and we want to go beyond the year or the decade. But it's been wonderful to listen to the different panelists. Thanks very much. We move from here.
Those comments, any other comment? It seems not at this stage. So if we have no further comments from either the member states or the public or any of the other panelists, we'll move into the closing session. So that now, of course, brings us to the end of today's forum. And I'm pleased to offer the floor to His Excellency Nestor Mendez, the Assistant Secretary General of the OAS, to give us these closing remarks. Ambassador Mendez, your closing remarks, sir.
Thank you very much, Ian. Her Excellency Maria del Carmen Rocaberg, Chair of the Permanent Council of the OAS and Permanent Representative of Panama to the OAS, distinguished permanent and alternate representatives and permanent observers accredited to the OAS, His Excellency and my good friend Luis Almagro, Secretary General, esteemed panelists, our virtual viewers, our dear friend, our coordinator for today, our moderator for today, Ian. A pleasant good morning to each and every one of you. It is my distinct honor and privilege to offer closing remarks at today's forum on ending slavery's legacy of racism, the imperative for strengthening justice and resilience in Afro-descendant communities in the Americas in the face of COVID-19. Today's forum marks the final event of this year's celebration of the 4th Inter-American Week for People of African Descent in the Americas. The topics, as we heard, addressed it today encapsulated the depth and breadth of the issues confronting Afro-descendants in the Americas, entrenched racism and discrimination, both subtle and overt, remain a sad legacy of slavery. In many countries, people of African descent are continuously subjected to discriminatory practices, wherein there is inequality in access to healthcare, education, banking services, and housing, among others. These disparities ultimately impede their upward social and economic mobility and full enjoyment of human rights, which are afforded to other non-marginalized racial and ethnic groups. The COVID-19 pandemic has glaringly unmasked these social inequalities. The data speaks for itself. In many countries, Afro-descendants are marginalized. They are the most vulnerable to the COVID-19 pandemic and are more likely to die from the virus than any other group. This disproportionate impact is largely due to Afro-descendants' lower economic standing in many of our societies, wherein they are most likely to work in the service industries, most affected by the virus. They live in overcrowded housing with inadequate sanitation and water services and poor access to healthcare. It is important to point out that this is not the situation in every country in our hemisphere. And the situation is different, primarily in countries where Afro-descendants form a larger percentage of the population and wield political and economic power. In many countries, however, advancement towards this level of socio-political and economic inclusion of Afro-descendants has been measured. Today's discussion provided a fulsome overview of the foregoing by highlighting the peculiar challenges facing Afro-descendants in light of pervasive structural racism found in anachronistic legislation and policies. This unsettling reality, lived by 1/5 of our hemisphere's population, must be confronted and adequately redressed. Our distinguished panelists, as you heard, offered numerous remedial actions and measures required to address this flagrant injustice and build resilience within Afro-descendant communities. Legislation and policies in our member states must promote the equality of rights of persons of African descent through equal access to healthcare, housing, employment, and education. The OAS acknowledges the painful paths journeyed by our African ancestors from the shores of their lands to an unknown hemisphere, which we now call the Americas. Through its numerous declarations, resolutions, and discussion events on recognizing these vulnerabilities and response measures, the OAS has sought to advance the special agenda for attaining recognition, justice, and advancement of persons of African descent in the hemisphere. Notwithstanding this, much work remains, and we are committed to continue working towards achieving greater equality for Afro-descendants by amplifying their voices and their causes. As we close this year's Inter-American Week, I wish to thank our esteemed panelists for their insightful presentations. We hope that your contributions today will lead to a greater understanding of these compounding issues and spur others to action. I also wish to thank everyone who assisted in the planning and execution of the week's activities. I extend special thanks to Her Excellency Maria del Carmen Roqueberg, Chair of the Permanent Council of the OAS and Permanent Representative of Panama to the OAS, and to our Secretary General, Luis Almagro, for their invaluable support. I also take this opportunity to recognize our collaborators, the Department of Social Inclusion in the Secretariat for Access to Rights and Equity, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the Department of Press and Communication, the Art Museum of the Americas, the Inter-American Commission of Women, and Kukili Afrofeminist Arts Collective. And most certainly, I express gratitude to all member states and permanent observers for their continued support. Very special thanks to the missions of the Dominican Republic, Canada, and the United States, without whose invaluable financial contribution this forum would not have been possible today. I also wish to give special recognition to our country offices who organize commemorative activities for the first time in their respective states. We applaud your commendable efforts and thank the governments for their immense support in organizing these inaugural events. We look forward to strengthening collaboration in future activities to commemorate our Inter-American Weeks. Finally, I extend heartfelt appreciation to the personnel in my office who assisted in the organization of the week's activities, with special commendation to Ms. Kendall Belial for coordinating the activities, as well as to Ambassador Henry Martin, to Tatiana and Abayomi. A heartfelt thank you also to Ian for coming and participating as you have done in previous weeks. Ian, it's great to have you. Thank you all once again for commemorating with us the Inter-American Week for people of African descent in the Americas. We wish you continued health and safety. Muchas gracias.
And with those poignant comments from our Assistant Secretary General, we bring to a close, of course, this session for today. But I just want to remind us as we reflect on what the theme was, ending slavery's legacy of racism, the imperative for strengthening justice and resilience in Afro-descendant communities in the Americas in the face of COVID-19. And hopefully over the next year, there will be a lot of thinking and action in moving us closer to the ideal. We wish you all the very best. Thank you again for tuning in.